The Australian Financial Review.
AGL has more emissions than the countries of Sweden, New Zealand or Ireland. It is more than every single car on the road in Australia, more than every single airplane in our skies, international or domestic. And we can change it by 2030 in a meaningful way.
That was tech billionaire and climate activist Mike Cannon-Brookes on 60 Minutes, talking about why he tried to buy AGL earlier this year. The takeover failed, but Cannon-Brookes didn't give up. He went on to build a stake in AGL of just over 11%, and now he's fighting his latest battle, an old-fashioned boardroom brawl. Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. Today, we talk to columnist James Thomson about the billionaire's push to have 4 new directors elected to AGL's board, what it might mean for Australia's energy transition, and why big corporations and environmental activists around the world are watching closely. It's Thursday, November 10. James, Australia's Parliament has just legislated a national emissions target. The new Labor government is spending up to $25 billion to get us to net zero by mid-century. We've got the UN climate talks happening in Egypt as we speak. But there's also an important event going on in corporate Australia. AGL, the country's biggest polluter, is holding its annual general meeting next Tuesday. Why is it important?
Well, Lisa, there's 2 things going on here. The first is a vote on AGL's inaugural climate action plan. And Mike Cannon-Brookes says this plan's not ambitious enough, and that's all good and well, but these votes are not binding. They're largely symbolic. But a rejection of the plan would be a bit of a black eye for AGL, but it wouldn't force them to actually do anything. So that's one thing to watch. The second thing to watch, though, is much more important, and that's this bid by Cannon-Brookes' vehicle, Grok Ventures, to elect 4 directors to the board. Now, they are former Tesla Energy executive Mark Twiddell, former energy regulator Kerry Schott, former Telstra director Christine Holman, and the former boss of Foster's, the beer company, John Polyers. Now, they have been handpicked by Mike Cannon-Brookes, and like him, they believe AGL needs help if it's to drive action on climate change faster. So it's a big showdown. How many of these directors, if any, will Mike Cannon-Brookes and Grok manage to get on the board?
So we'll talk a bit more about the directors, but first of all, in one corner we've got the tech billionaire turned corporate activist, and in the other we've got the country's biggest electricity supplier. So tell us a little bit about Mike Cannon-Brookes. How did he make his fortune? How did he come to be the person behind the push to overhaul AGL?
Mike Cannon-Brookes is, I guess, one of the great entrepreneurial success stories of the last couple of decades, I reckon. He and a uni friend, Scott Farquhar, they founded a company called Atlassian in their 20s. They had $10,000 on a credit card, and away they went and built this global tech sensation. Now, for those who don't know, Atlassian's a tech company that helps other tech companies. It's the best way to think of it. So when it floated in 2015, it was bigger than Qantas. Everyone got very excited. Subsequently, this business during the sort of froth of 2021 on global markets got to be worth $157 billion at its peak. Now, it's recently hit a bit of a roadblock. Some bad guidance and bad earnings results last week saw the stock lose 30% in one day. It's now worth $48 billion. Cannon-Brookes is still sitting towards the top of the Australian Financial Review's rich list. He's worth about $27 billion. And he's chosen to direct a chunk of that into climate activism. And that sort of coin allows you to be pretty outspoken.
What they're fearful of is the transition. They're fearful of change. The government has asked for private markets to come and deliver a solution here. That's exactly what we're planning to do. We're bringing $20 billion worth of investment.
So Cannon-Brookes has had a few goes here at AGL. First one was in March when he teamed up with Canadian investment giant Brookfield to make an $8 billion bid for AGL.
Australian billionaire and climate activist Mike Cannon-Brookes is putting his money where his mouth is. He's teamed up with a huge Canadian...
And they claimed that AGL was the greatest decarbonisation opportunity in the world. And they were going to come in, restructure the business and make an awful lot of money along the way.
If the takeover was to be successful, they would invest another $10 billion and accelerate the death of coal in this country. It would be a seismic shift.
But it was a pretty low-ball bid. They didn't really offer shareholders a big premium. AGL quickly rejected it, and the bid sort of fell over.
An offer put forward Saturday before an emergency board meeting Sunday. AGL rejected it, saying the proposal does not offer an adequate premium for a change of control.
As Brookfield and Mike Cannon-Brookes said, it was pens down on that deal. But then in May...
Tech billionaire Mike Cannon-Brookes has become AGL's largest shareholder in a last-minute bid to block the energy giant's demerger.
He announces that he's bought an 11.3% stake, and he has the express purpose here of trying to prevent AGL from demerging the company, from splitting the company in two. On the good side of AGL was going to be an energy retailer. On the bad side was a company holding all its coal-fired power assets. Mike Cannon-Brookes didn't like this plan. He thought that keeping the business together was more important in terms of reducing its emissions faster.
The merger is a very flawed strategy. I think it's globally irresponsible. I think it is a very poor outcome for shareholders, and I'll be making that case, and a poor outcome for Australia and the government ultimately.
And so he campaigned long and loud and quite hard against this demerger. And lo and behold, he pulled this campaign off. In June, the company announced that they were abandoning their demerger plan. And so Mike Cannon-Brookes is still left as an 11.3% shareholder looking to influence what comes next at AGL.
He certainly won that battle. So if you look into his background, does he have the sort of green credentials or the track record or the history of trying to shift public policy? Is he the guy to overhaul AGL?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think he's been a sort of, environmental activist for some time, perhaps not as seriously as this. It all started back in 2017. He was on Twitter when South Australia was having these blackouts, and Cannon-Brookes challenged another young billionaire, a guy called Elon Musk, who now, much to his disappointment, I think, owns Twitter. But anyway, Cannon-Brookes was on there and he said to Elon, why don't you build a massive battery in South Australia where these blackouts are occurring and we'll be able to stop these blackouts together? Musk took up the challenge, built the battery, and it's been relatively successful in South Australia, which hasn't had as many of the energy supply issues that it did have. Cannon-Brookes has got lots of other little green investments. So he's got a business called Sun Cable, which hopes to run an undersea cable from the Northern Territory to Singapore and then export solar energy made in Australia over to Asia. He and his wife have a company called Boundless, which is a $1.5 billion green fund that targets electric vehicles and electrification of homes. There's another little company called Brighty, which helps fund solar installations. But I think it's also worth sort of pointing out here, Cannon-Brookes has got this great knack of being a really good communicator on these issues. So simplifying sort of complex ideas and presenting him in an accessible way. I remember when he announced that he'd bought this 11.3% stake, we had an interview with him and we were talking about, sort of campaigning against the demerger and did he think he'd be able to get enough attention and get the message out there? And he sort of said, come on, mate, we don't have any trouble getting our message out there. And of course, that's exactly right. Sure enough, that night he was on every major current affairs program, from the Project to the 7:30 report.
And Atlassian CEO Mike Cannon-Brookes himself joins us now to tell us more.
Mike,
you've already
is
tried
the chief
twice
executive
to buy
of Atlassian. Mike Cannon-Brookes joins us now. Morning to you.
He joins me now. Mike Cannon-Brookes, welcome to breakfast.
And the man himself, Mike Cannon-Brookes, joins us now live.
He does have a sort of charisma and magnetism.
Well, you little troublemaker, you, Mike, eh?
That is in stark contrast to most of the people in the business community who tend to be a bit more conservative and dry. He's a colourful figure.
He's clever in the way he uses his profile to push his causes. So back to his current campaign to get these like-minded directors on the board of AGL. How's he going? Is it, as some have claimed, a takeover by stealth?
Yeah, it's a fair criticism, I think. Cannon-Brookes and Grok is AGL's biggest shareholder, so they've got an 11.3% stake. The general rule here is every 10% gets you a director, a seat on the board. So with 11.3%, he should be entitled to one director. But the issue here is he's handpicked and nominated 4 directors who he sees as having the experience and skills need. Now, it would be quite extraordinary for a holder of 11.3% to have 4 nominees. The question is, do you see those as Mike Cannon-Brookes nominees, or do you see them as independent directors that just happen to have been nominated by Mike Cannon-Brookes? Now, that might sound like a distinction without a difference, but that's what Cannon-Brookes is essentially saying here. Yes, I'm nominating these guys, but they will not act for me or act in concert with me after their appointment to the board. What's interesting is that proxy advisors, now these guys are the consultants who look at AGM resolutions on behalf of institutional investors, such as super funds. They've largely backed Mike Cannon-Brookes' views. They've thrown their support behind most of the candidates, so we've seen AGL fight back relatively gently, and then they've questioned the independence of the candidates, although Patricia McKenzie's walked back a little bit from that.
So can I please welcome Patricia McKenzie, who's the chair of AGL, and she will be in conversation with them.
But I think Patricia McKenzie's big point is that she doesn't want to run the company for one shareholder. She wants to make sure it's run for all shareholders.
This is an independent board of directors, and in our opinion, we have to continue to have an independent board of directors that represents 100% of the shareholders, and 88% of those are not Grok.
So the question is, do these directors work as a block? And if so, could having 4 of the 8 directors on the board give him much more power than an 11.3% shareholder would otherwise have?
James, we've been talking a lot about Mike Cannon-Brookes. Tell us about AGL. Are they doing enough to cut their emissions? Should they adopt Mike Cannon-Brookes' more ambitious plan? And is his plan even possible?
Yeah, well, AGL is blue blood corporate Australia. This was a company formed in Sydney in 1837 as Australian Gas and Light Company. It is, part of the fabric of the Australian business landscape, I think. They've been running coal-fired power stations for a long time, and about 7 years ago they bought a portfolio of coal-fired power stations that increased their emissions. Looked like a good deal at the time to some people, but of course, with the benefit of hindsight, it's become a bit of a millstone around their neck. So after Mike Cannon-Brookes knocked over the demerger, they released a strategic review, and basically this committed to speeding up the closure of the coal-fired power stations. So the last one would close by 2035. They've been trying to increase their investment in renewable energy, and they're thinking of smart ways to use those existing coal-fired power plant sites and try and turn them into renewable energy hubs. And of course, they're running their retail business on the side. Now, the problem that they've got, though, is that Mike Cannon-Brookes says that even closing the coal-fired power stations in 2035 is only in line with 1.8 degrees of warming, where the sort of Paris target is for 1.5 degrees of warming, and that's where he wants AGL to be. And Mackenzie has pushed back at that, though. What she's argued that to get to 1.5 degrees, AGL would need to close all its coal-fired power stations by at least 2029, and all coal-fired power stations across Australia's national electricity market would have to shut by 2031. And there's lots of ramifications to that. The first one would be that Australia would need 98 gigawatts of what's called firming capacity. So this is power production that can be used as a backstop for renewable energy. But over the last 5 years, the average amount of new capacity of this firming capacity in the NEM has only been 2.2 gigawatts. So you can see how much more firming capacity we need to make this work. So this isn't just an AGL problem. This is an Australian energy problem. And that is one of the criticisms of Mike Cannon-Brookes. He's good on the big idea, on the goal of where he wants to go. But there's not a lot of detail. There's no specific plan from Grok or Cannon-Brookes on how AGL should get to 1.5 degrees. So this is the sort of debate we've got. How fast can we go? How practical is it to go that fast?
James, on the issue of the directors, AGL is recommending that shareholders vote in favour of one of the candidates, Mark Trudell, the former Tesla executive. Are they undercutting any argument that the directors aren't independent by supporting one of them?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Lisa. I think they have undercut their own argument against independence, and I think that's why we've seen it toned down. I think, too, with at least a couple of Cannon-Brookes' other candidates, Kerry Schott, hugely respected energy regulator. I mean, difficult to imagine someone more respected in Australia's energy market.
Grok rang me and asked me if I'd stand as a director, and I thought about it a little and thought, well, why not? So it's actually as simple as that with me. It's not a conspiracy at all.
So those candidates, their credentials are good. Mike Cannon-Brookes says the concerns about independence are bullshit, and he hasn't spoken to some of these candidates. There's been no contact. There's no legal agreement with any of them. And Kerry Schott's backed that up too. She said she'd never even met Brookes or spoken to him.
As far as I know, the only thing I have in common with Mike Cannon-Brookes is a desire to lower emissions in the country and get on with doing it as fast as we can.
This is a story that's captured the attention, certainly of our newsroom, and even in the broader community. People are talking about this meeting. How does it compare to other boardroom battles?
We have seen a few examples like this. Probably the most famous one is in 2008. Kerry Stokes wanted to get control of West Australian newspapers. He eventually got a couple of directors on the board there and slowly got control, but he had to have a much bigger stake. It was over 20%. Rupert Murdoch's done a few similar things. You know, he's got 30% of the shares in News Corp, but, you know, a pretty strong grip on the boardroom there. So there's that element too. How much control can a shareholder with 11.3% actually get? It's a good test case for corporate Australia from that view. And then there's the sort of environmental question. You know, is this a new form of shareholder activism where we're getting a billionaire who's not going into this necessarily with financial reasons as his number one priority, but is willing to do something else?
That's right, and he may be a little bit distracted, as you mentioned before, about Atlassian's results last week. There's obviously some attention needed there.
Yes.
But as far as this boardroom battle, or whatever we want to call it, goes, is it fair to say that energy giants around the world will be watching to see what happens here?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. I mean, usually we get two types of activist campaigns. Either we get a big, wealthy institutional investor who has a financial motive. You know, they want to come in, change the company, improve returns, engineer a takeover. Or we get the environmental activist who's usually from the non-profit sector. They've got limited resources and they're pushing a very specific barrow. What Cannon-Brookes has done here is sort of brought those two things together. We've got the billionaire with very deep pockets and lots of resources, but he's got this environmental bent. So this is a great test case. We had a good test case a couple of years ago at Exxon, the big oil company. There was an activist investor called Engine One that managed to get 3 directors elected to the board. But this is the first example in Australia that's got So many directors involved at once, such a high-profiled billionaire investor backing it all, and then the case study of AGL in the energy transition. So it's easy to write Mike Cannon-Brookes off as having good intentions and plenty of cash, but no detailed plan. But there is something to be said for having that sort of agent provocateur figure who can get people talking and get people thinking and possibly get people voting on the floor of the AGL meeting in a different way than they might have 12 months ago. But I think the question is, how does this transition unfold from here for AGL and for the country? We need detailed plans and we need flawless execution, but we also need to get going. So perhaps with different people around the board table, AGL can move faster in the right direction, but a hell of a lot more will need to go right for AGL and Australia to get anywhere near its climate goals.
James, thanks so much for taking the time. You've followed the twists and turns of this saga very closely, and I think you'll be in the annual meeting next Tuesday, is that right?
I'll certainly be watching, absolutely.
Are you expecting fireworks?
Often these things get decided before the AGM, actually. So either the board might see the writing on the wall and sort of go down meekly, or it'll be run right up until the vote's on the floor of the meeting, which will be fabulous to watch. So, of course, I'm barracking for fireworks on the floor of the meeting. That'd be great.
Thanks, James.
Thanks, Lisa.
Here's the other big stories we're covering this week. China-based crypto exchange Binance has offered to buy rival FTX.com for an undisclosed amount. Australian crypto fund managers have likened FTX's rapid decline to the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which sparked the global financial crisis. And people with cocaine and opioid addictions have been targeted in the first dump of Medibank customer data by Russia-linked criminals. The data contains details of about 200 patients, but Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who confirmed he is a Medibank customer, said the insurer was right not to pay a ransom. Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray with James Thomson reporting. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow and Lap Fan. Fiona Buffini is the executive producer. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.